The station was alive with expectation that evening, though no one could have known how quickly that anticipation would sour into something far darker. The year was slipping into its last chill months, when winter shadows stretched across the plains and the cold settled like a warning over the fields. Families gathered in clusters on the wooden platform, the glow of lanterns flickering against their breath in the air. They had been told that a train was coming, an orphan train carrying children from New York City, boys and girls with no parents, no homes, no one to claim them. Here in this small Midwestern town, they would be given new lives, folded into households eager for helping hands and the promise of redemption. Men stood stiffly in their coats, hats pulled low, scanning the tracks as if willing the iron beast to emerge from the horizon. Women clutched shawls around their shoulders, their hands warm with the nervous energy of preparation. Some carried baskets of bread or woolen blankets. Others had fashioned small toys, dolls carved of wood, little cloth animals meant to soften the strangeness of transition for whichever child might be placed in their home. And the children of the town, their eyes wide with both curiosity and envy, whispered to one another. Who would the newcomers be? Would they be friends, playmates, rivals in the fields and classrooms? The sound of the approaching train arrived long before its body came into sight. A low, rolling thunder that trembled in the wooden slats of the platform. A shriek of metal against metal as the whistle cut through the dusk. Excitement swelled. Mothers squeezed their children's hands, fathers straightened their backs, and a hush settled over the crowd as the first plumes of smoke rose against the orange-pink horizon. The train came in heavy and slow, groaning as though reluctant to stop. Its cars stretched long into the night, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The station master, lantern in hand, stepped forward to guide it in. Sparks hissed from the wheels as brakes bit against the rails. The whistle screamed once more, echoing off the barren fields, until it sounded less like machinery and more like a cry. Then silence, save for the hiss of steam. The townsfolk waited for the doors to open, for the chatter of young voices, for the clatter of small shoes rushing toward the platform. But nothing came. The silence pressed heavier with each second, until the mothers glanced nervously at one another, and the fathers muttered under their breath. At last, a conductor appeared, though even his figure seemed subdued, pale under the lantern's glow. Without a word, he unlatched the first carriage door. It swung open with a hollow groan. Inside was nothing. No children, no luggage, not even a trace of occupancy, only rows of benches and the stale scent of coal smoke. A ripple of confusion spread through the waiting crowd. Perhaps the children were farther back. In another car, the conductor moved to the next. He opened it. Empty again. One after another, doors were unlatched, creaking wide to reveal the same barren interiors. Coaches that should have been full of laughter and frightened whispers were hollow as tombs. At first, disbelief gave way to irritation. Whispers of clerical error, a train diverted, a bureaucratic mistake. But irritation soon unraveled into unease. Some swore they had glimpsed small faces at the windows as the train slowed into the station, translucent pale cheeks pressed against the glass, eyes wide and searching. Others claimed they heard whispers beneath the rumble, the faint rise and fall of children's voices, like a choir buried beneath machinery. Yet when the cars stood still and opened, all that remained was absence. The station master demanded answers, but the conductor could only shake his head. He spoke of having been given his orders, of having departed the city with his manifest in hand, yet he faltered when pressed about boarding. His memory blurred at the crucial point. Had the children ever truly climbed aboard? He thought so, yes. Or perhaps that was another train, another day. His words stumbled into vagueness, as if something unseen had reached in and pulled loose the threads of recollection. As the night deepened, the crowd lingered, unwilling to disperse. Mothers still clutched their baskets. Fathers shifted uneasily, their voices now low and grim. And the children of the town, who had so eagerly awaited new friends, clung to their parents' coats, their earlier excitement replaced by an instinctual fear they could not name. The longer they stared at the dark train cars, the more they felt as though something stared back from the void. The engine hissed, restless. The conductor, pale and shaken, finally announced the train would continue onward, though no one could say to where. The empty cars creaked, as if in protest, as though they had once been heavy and were now too light, a skeleton stripped of its marrow. When the train pulled away, its whistle howled again, long, mournful, almost human. Some swore it was not steam but voices, a chorus of children crying out as the wheels dragged them farther into the night. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the countryside. Some dismissed it as a bureaucratic mishap, others as a rumor exaggerated in retelling, yet those who had stood on the platform that evening never forgot the hollow weight of expectation collapsing into dread. They remembered the empty cars, the creak of doors swinging open onto nothingness, and the whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the children had never truly been meant to arrive. It became a tale of unease, told in hushed tones when trains screamed in the distance. A legend that burrowed into local folklore, the orphan train that came with nothing but shadows. And though officials tried to explain it away, though the story slipped into rumor and then into ghost tale, one detail endured across every telling: the sound of that final whistle, crying into the night like a lament for children who never came home. They called it one of the greatest social experiments in American history, a movement born of compassion, desperation, and, depending on who you ask, convenient cruelty. Between 1854 and 1929, nearly 250,000 children were transported across the country aboard what became known as the orphan trains. The idea seemed noble enough. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were overrun with children abandoned by poverty, disease, or circumstance. Some had lost their parents to cholera, tuberculosis, or the countless plagues that thrived in overcrowded tenements. Others were the children of immigrants who had simply disappeared into the machinery of survival, unable to care for the offspring they left behind. And still others had no names, no histories, simply infants left on church steps or in alleyways, entrusted to no one and claimed by nothing. By the middle of the 19th century, New York alone was teeming with tens of thousands of homeless children. They slept in doorways, scavenged for scraps, begged on street corners. The newspapers of the time called them street Arabs, a cruel label that stripped them of humanity and reduced them to shadows of the urban underclass. For reformers like Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister and founder of the Children's Aid Society, the sight was intolerable. He believed these children could be saved, not by charity alone, but by relocation. The idea was simple: send the children west, out of the soot-choked streets and into the clean air of rural America, where open fields and hard labor might remake them into respectable citizens. Families who wanted children could have them. Farmers who needed labor would receive it. The children, in turn, would be granted homes, opportunity, and what Brace called the fresh, wholesome influences of country life. The first orphan train departed New York City in 1854, carrying 46 children bound for Michigan. Over the decades, thousands more followed. The trains rolled out in long succession, sometimes with hundreds of children packed aboard, each clutching a small bundle of belongings, if they had any at all. Conductors and chaperones, often volunteers from charitable societies, oversaw the transport. At each stop, the children were paraded before waiting crowds, lined up in rows, inspected and chosen. The selection process was for many humiliating. Children were looked over as if they were livestock, their teeth examined, their muscles flexed, their bodies appraised for strength and stamina. Farmers often wanted strong boys to plow and till, while households sometimes preferred young girls to cook and clean. Siblings were separated, sometimes permanently. Infants were plucked from their older brothers and sisters, never to be reunited. The official narrative painted a picture of salvation. Newspaper articles praised the program as the great charitable endeavor of the age. Reports spoke of ragged street children transformed into healthy farm boys, their delinquency erased by the purifying air of the countryside. Reformers lauded their vision as a triumph over poverty, a moral crusade that would reshape the future of the nation. But behind the glowing reports lurked another story. Not every child found a loving home. Many were not adopted at all but indentured, treated less as sons and daughters than as farmhands bound by obligation. Some endured relentless labor from sunrise to sunset, fed poorly and beaten if they resisted. Others disappeared entirely, their names lost in the fog of inadequate record-keeping. A child could vanish into the folds of the countryside, and no one from the city would ever come searching. In some towns, the arrival of the orphan train was celebrated. In others, it was met with suspicion. Local families wondered what diseases or moral corruption the children might bring. Some whispered that they were city trash, unwanted for a reason. Religious tensions also played their role. Protestant reformers often sent children into predominantly Catholic communities, sowing resentment and division. Even among the reformers themselves, intentions blurred. Were they truly motivated by compassion, or by a desire to solve the social nuisance of street children who cluttered their sidewalks and darkened the city's image? The children were not consulted. Their consent was neither asked for nor considered. They were cargo in a grand experiment, shuffled from station to station, their identities reduced to tags pinned to their clothes. And yet for some, the orphan train was salvation. There are countless stories of children who found genuine families, who grew into adulthood with opportunities they would never have known otherwise. A few rose to prominence in politics, business, even law enforcement. They carried with them the memory of leaving the city with nothing, only to find a place where they could belong. But for every story of redemption, another lingered in shadows. Children who were promised homes that never materialized. Children who fled from cruel masters and vanished into the wilderness. Children whose graves remain unmarked, their short lives swallowed by the vast emptiness of the American frontier. The movement was both a solution and a crime, both hope and betrayal. Its legacy is complicated, a collision of noble ideals and harsh realities. By the time the last orphan train rolled out in 1929, the world had changed. Social welfare systems were beginning to evolve, and the idea of mass relocation had lost its luster. But the stories remained, both the triumphs and the tragedies. And in those stories lies the unsettling possibility that not every train carried its passengers to safety. Some trains were recorded leaving stations, their manifests listing dozens of children. Yet at the other end of the line, fewer arrivals were counted. Records went missing. Children vanished somewhere between departure and destination. Were they misplaced in a bureaucracy overwhelmed by numbers? Or were some simply erased, swallowed by systems that did not care enough to notice their absence? When word spread of a train that arrived utterly empty, its cars barren, its benches unsadders, its air heavy with the ghost of expectation, it tapped directly into these darker truths. For those who knew the movement's history, the story was not impossible. For some it was not even surprising. If children could vanish one by one, why not all at once? What was meant to be salvation, after all, was always balanced on the edge of exploitation. And behind every polished speech about rescuing the forgotten, there lingered a question few dared ask aloud: how many of these children were truly saved, and how many simply disappeared into the silence of the rails? The children who filled the orphan trains did not appear out of nowhere. They were born into a world already stacked against them, forged in the smoke and shadows of America's largest cities. If you want to understand the emptiness of that train, the way its silence felt like a wound, you first have to understand the lives of the children who were supposed to be inside. Imagine New York City in the 1850s. The streets were alive, but not with the kind of life anyone would envy. Overcrowded tenements leaned against each other like crooked teeth, windows broken, air thick with soot and sewage. Horses clattered past, their droppings mixing with the rain to form a black, choking sludge that coated every step. Within this chaos, children roamed in swarms. Some had parents who worked 12-hour shifts in sweatshops, leaving them to scavenge for themselves. Others had no parents at all. Disease made orphans by the hundreds. Cholera swept through entire neighborhoods, sparing no one, not even the smallest bodies. Tuberculosis filled lungs with blood and silence. Fires, so common in the wooden warrens of the city, could strip a family down to ashes in a single night. Poverty did the rest. Some parents, broken by hunger and despair, left their children at churches, hospitals, or simply on street corners, hoping someone else might give them a chance. Many never came back. The children became a class unto themselves. Newspapers called them street rats, urchins, gutter snipes. They slept beneath bridges, in doorways, or on rooftops. They formed gangs, not out of malice but survival, bands of 10-year-olds teaching each other how to pickpocket, how to fight off older boys, how to slip unseen between policemen and crowds. The older ones guarded the younger, though not always well. Hunger ruled every choice. Descriptions from the time paint a bleak picture. A missionary once wrote of finding a child barely 5 years old, barefoot in winter, digging through trash for scraps of bread. Another recalled walking through 5 Points, a neighborhood infamous for crime and poverty, and seeing dozens of children huddled against the cold, their breath rising in the night air like smoke from extinguished candles. Some sold matches, newspapers, or flowers to scrape together pennies. Others offered to shine shoes or carry loads. But many turned to theft, their small hands quick and unnoticed until caught. It wasn't just the city that saw them as a nuisance. Even reformers who championed the orphan train program described the children in language that stripped away innocence. They were painted as criminals in waiting, as weeds growing wild in the cracks of civilization. Their salvation, reformers claimed, would not come from within the city, but from tearing them away from it entirely. But to imagine these children only as statistics or shadows is to miss the humanity that clung stubbornly to them. They laughed, they played, they dreamed. Some clutched siblings tightly, refusing to let go even when hunger gnawed at them. Some carried tokens of parents they could barely remember, a ribbon, a photograph, a locket. Many told stories of the families they once had, repeating names and faces so they would not be forgotten. When the Children's Aid Society and other organizations began to round them up for the trains, the promise was seductive: open skies, clean air, a family to call their own. Some children believed it wholeheartedly. Others resisted, terrified of being taken from the only city they knew, even if that city had nearly killed them. Brothers and sisters were often split apart in the process, parceled onto different trains or assigned to different destinations. Officials called it necessity. To the children, it was abandonment all over again. Those who boarded the trains carried little more than the clothes on their backs. If they were lucky, a chaperone gave them a small Bible, a piece of bread, or a new set of shoes. But many had nothing. Some were so young, they could not even speak their own last names. To the world, they were blank slates. To themselves, they were fragments, haunted by the memory of mothers' faces, fathers' voices, the warmth of homes that no longer existed. And yet, despite the hardship, many accounts describe a quiet resilience. These children were hardened by survival, yes, but they were not empty. Their eyes carried defiance. Their laughter, when it came, rang sharp and bright, startling in its sincerity. They were, in every sense, children of the forgotten streets. It is in this context that the legend of the empty train becomes so unsettling. To imagine cars rolling into a rural town with no passengers is to imagine not just a logistical failure, but the absence of hundreds of beating hearts. Every empty bench would have represented a child who might have lived there, whose hunger, pain, and laughter could have filled that space. Instead, there was only silence. The children of the orphan trains embodied both tragedy and hope. They were the unwanted and the desperately needed, the abandoned and the promised. And when they vanished, whether by paperwork lost, by neglect unrecorded, or by something darker, it was not just the loss of lives, it was the loss of futures that had barely begun. This is the weight that hangs over the story of the orphan train that arrived empty. It is not just a ghost story, not just a folk tale to chill the spine. It is a reflection of the countless unnamed children who slipped through the cracks of history. Some found homes, many did not. Some survived, many more disappeared, their names erased, their stories untold. The legend resonates because it feels like a symbol of all those vanished children, the silent train, the hollow carriages, the spaces where laughter should have been. A reminder that behind every statistic was a child of the forgotten streets, waiting for a chance that for too many never came. The night of the empty train is remembered differently depending on who you ask. Some accounts sound like history, written down in shaky ink on yellowing paper. Others come from the realm of folklore, carried in whispers from parent to child, generation after generation, until the details blurred into something like myth. But all versions share one chilling truth. A train was expected, children were promised, and when the steel wheels ground to a halt, there was no one inside. It was late autumn, sometime in the 1870s, when the train was said to have departed New York City. Records, those few that survive, suggest at least 36 children were scheduled to board. Their names appeared on a manifest, though not all were complete. Some children were recorded only by their first names, or even just as boy or girl. The chaperone's signature was there, though the ink had begun to fade by the time historians later examined it. The intended destination was a small farming town in the Midwest, a place that had sent word it could take in dozens of children. Families were waiting. Beds had been made, meals prepared, futures imagined. The townsfolk gathered at the station long before the train was due to arrive, lanterns swung on iron hooks, their light barely pushing back the deepening dusk. The air was crisp, laced with the smell of burning wood from nearby chimneys. Some of the waiting families held signs with names written in chalk, names they hoped to bestow upon their new sons and daughters. Others carried small bundles of clothing or gifts. There was a current of excitement, yes, but also nerves. Taking in a child was no small commitment. And yet, beneath all of that, there was something like hope. Then came the sound. A low rumble that grew steadily louder, shaking the wooden planks of the platform. Steam hissed into the night. A whistle split the air. The train crept into view, its headlamp cutting through the dark like a single glaring eye. The children of the town pressed forward, eager to be the first to see. The adults held them back with firm hands. The locomotive rolled past, dragging its long tail of passenger cars. To many, it looked exactly as they expected, a great iron beast bearing the weight of promise. But a few later swore that something felt off even then. They said the cars seemed too still, too quiet, as though the windows reflected only emptiness. Some of the women on the platform recalled leaning closer, hoping to glimpse small faces peering out, but seeing only their own distorted reflections in the glass. Others insisted that they did see movement. One farmer's wife claimed she spotted a pale hand against the window, only for it to vanish when the train screeched to a halt. The conductor stepped down, his uniform neat, but his face drawn, as though he had not slept in days. He did not greet the crowd at first. Instead, he paused, staring at the train behind him, as though unsure what he was about to reveal. The station master, sensing the unease, approached with his lantern held high. Together, they walked to the first car. The latch clattered open. The door swung outward with a groan. And inside, nothing. The benches were bare. The floor was littered with nothing more than coal dust and scraps of paper. The lamps along the ceiling had burned low, casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers. But there were no children. Not a single one. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Surely, they thought, the children must be farther down, in another car. The conductor moved quickly, unlatching the second door. Again, emptiness. A third, empty. One after another, the coaches revealed nothing but silence. Some said the air inside the cars was colder than outside, as though the heat of human bodies had been stripped away. A few swore they heard sounds, soft, fleeting, like the scuff of shoes across wood, or a whisper too low to catch. One mother, holding her daughter's hand, later claimed she heard laughter, faint and distant, though the cars were visibly vacant. The station master demanded an explanation, but the conductor stammered. He spoke of his orders, of receiving children in New York, but when pressed to recall boarding, his memory fractured. He thought he remembered a crowd of little ones climbing aboard. Or perhaps that was another journey, another year. His certainty dissolved into confusion. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the manifests, papers that seemed incomplete, some names smudged beyond recognition. The townsfolk began to argue. Some accused the railroad of incompetence. Others whispered of darker possibilities. Had the children been taken elsewhere, sold into labor or worse? And still others, their voices low and uneasy, wondered if the children had ever existed at all. That night stretched on endlessly. Families who had prepared beds returned home in silence. The toys, the clothing, the meals set aside, left unused. For weeks afterward, the station became a place of dread. Some claimed that if you stood there late at night, you could still hear the train arriving, its whistle long and mournful, though no engine ever appeared. One farmer told his grandchildren that he had seen faces in the dark windows, faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide with something between fear and pleading. But when the doors opened, the faces were gone. Another local woman swore she saw footprints in the dust of one of the cars, small and scattered, but when she blinked they vanished. The legend only deepened as the years passed. Historians scoured records for evidence of the train, but inconsistencies abounded. Some logs confirmed its departure, yet arrival records were missing. The Children's Aid Society had no clear explanation. The names on the manifests did not match with any later adoption records. It was as though those children had been swallowed whole by the rails themselves. And so the story endured, not just as a bureaucratic mystery, but as something heavier, something that hung in the air like smoke. An orphan train that arrived with no orphans. A promise of salvation that dissolved into silence. For those who had stood on the platform that night, the memory was a scar. They had heard the whistle, seen the steam, smelled the coal. They had opened the doors one by one, expecting laughter, cries, chatter. But what they received was emptiness. An emptiness so profound that it echoed through generations, whispered into legend as the night of the empty train. What could explain it? That was the question asked again and again in the weeks, months, and eventually decades after the train rolled into the station carrying no one. For the townsfolk who had waited with arms outstretched, it was not enough to call it a mistake. Too much had been promised. Too much had been prepared. The absence was not just logistical, it was personal, even spiritual. Something had gone terribly wrong. The most practical explanation was, of course, human error. Railroads in the 19th century were chaotic by nature. Lines overlapped, schedules clashed, and communication traveled slower than the trains themselves. Telegraph wires carried messages, but storms or technical failures often left dispatches garbled or lost altogether. Could it have been that the children were sent elsewhere, their destination reassigned without notice? Was it possible the train that arrived empty was not the one meant for the town at all, but a misrouted passenger line mistakenly expected as an orphan delivery? There were precedents for such confusion. Surviving reports from the orphan train movement mentioned children disembarking in towns that had not prepared for them, while other towns waited in vain, their promised train never arriving. In some cases, the mix-up was resolved within days. In others, the children simply vanished into different records, reassigned, misplaced in paperwork, so fragile it barely survived the years. For a program that relocated more than 200,000 children, perhaps one or two trains gone awry would not seem impossible. And yet, this case felt different. Not one or two children misplaced, but all of them. An entire trainload. That was harder to dismiss. Another theory emerged almost immediately. Corruption. The Children's Aid Society and other organizations oversaw the distribution of children, but oversight was thin. There are accounts, often whispered, rarely written, of children being redirected into labor camps, sweatshops, or worse. Farmers who wanted cheap, obedient workers could pay small sums under the table. Factory owners with no qualms about child labor sometimes struck similar bargains. Once the children were removed from the city, they were largely beyond the gaze of reformers. Many simply disappeared. Was the empty train not a failure, but a cover? Did the children ever truly set out for the town that waited, or were they siphoned away beforehand, delivered to places not recorded, to people who never intended to raise them as family. Some historians believe this was entirely plausible. Records from the era show countless gaps, names with no destinations, departures with no arrivals, children who appear in one ledger only to vanish in the next. It was a system ripe for abuse, and the children themselves, voiceless, powerless, often nameless, were easy to erase. If such corruption occurred once, why not on the scale of an entire train? Yet even these darker possibilities cannot fully explain the strangeness reported that night. The witnesses spoke not just of absence but of presence, the sound of whispers, the glimpse of small faces at the windows, the laughter some claimed to hear echoing through the empty cars. Bureaucratic failure could not account for that. And then there were the records themselves. Surviving documents are inconsistent. Some manifests list dozens of children scheduled to travel. Others contain only partial names, as if hastily written or deliberately obscured. In one surviving log, the line for total number of passengers has been left blank, the ink trailing off mid-stroke. To researchers who uncovered it years later, it looked less like a clerical oversight and more like hesitation, someone uncertain about what to record. Even more troubling are the accounts of railway workers. A brakeman who claimed to have been on the journey reportedly told his grandson that he never saw the children after the first stop. "They boarded all right," he supposedly said. "I heard them, laughed like birds. But then, it went quiet. Too quiet." By the next morning, the cars were empty. When pressed by his family, the old man refused to elaborate. He would only shake his head and mutter, "We never should have stopped where we did." What did he mean? The story is maddeningly vague. Some researchers speculate the train may have made an unscheduled stop in the wilderness. But if so, why? And what happened there? No surviving documents confirm such a detour. Folklore, of course, takes these gaps and fills them with darker shapes. Some say the children were stolen by strangers who boarded under cover of night. Others whisper that illness swept through the train and the bodies were removed in secret to prevent scandal. The most chilling tales suggest something less tangible, that the children were swallowed not by human hands, but by something lurking in the stretches of empty land between departure and arrival. To skeptics, these theories are nonsense. To believers, they are the only explanations that account for the witnesses' unease. Either way, the contradictions leave no comfortable ground. The mystery of the empty train forces us to confront the fragility of history itself. The orphan train movement was vast, sprawling across decades and states, but its paper trail is riddled with holes. For every child who left a city station, a new name was written down. But how many of those names ever resurfaced? How many were lost to bad ink, careless record keepers, or something far worse? When researchers tried to follow the threads of the empty train, they found nothing at the other end. No adoption papers, no census entries, no graves marked with children's names. Only silence and the memory of those who had waited in vain. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is also the simplest, that the children never boarded at all. That their names were written, their departure recorded, but the seats remained empty from the very beginning. If that is true, then why were the families told to prepare? Why did the conductor himself seem uncertain, as though he had half memories of children who may never have existed? Theories abound, but none settle the matter. Human error, corruption, abduction, or something far stranger. Each explanation accounts for part of the story, but not all. And that is the essence of the mystery. Somewhere between departure and arrival, history slipped. And in that silence, 100 questions were born. For years after the night of the empty train, the story lived mostly as rumor, a tale passed among townsfolk and curious historians. But scattered through time are stranger fragments, voices that claimed to remember, diaries that spoke in half-truths, descendants who swore their families carried secrets too heavy to forget. Whether they are genuine testimonies or embellishments is hard to know, yet taken together, they form a patchwork of whispered accounts that suggest the children of the train may not have been entirely lost. One story comes from a battered notebook, preserved in the archives of a small Midwestern historical society. The author identified herself only as HM, a young woman who worked as a volunteer for the Children's Aid Society in the 1870s. In one entry, she describes escorting a group of children to the train station in New York. She writes of 33 small souls, wide-eyed and trembling, their bags no larger than a loaf of bread. She recalls helping them board, comforting a girl no older than 7, who clutched a wooden doll, with its paint peeling away. And then, her words shift. The whistle sounded, the train lurched, and for a moment I feared they had gone somewhere beyond my reach. That fear did not leave me. Days later, I was told they never arrived. I have prayed ever since, but their faces return to me at night. Another account comes from oral history, passed down in a family in Iowa. The family claimed their great-grandmother, as a child, was supposed to receive a new sister from the orphan train. But what she remembered most was not the absence, but the sound. She described standing on the platform, hearing children laughing, dozens of voices carried on the air as the train slowed to a stop. Yet when the doors opened, the sound died instantly. She spent her life convinced the laughter had not been imagined. Some accounts are even more haunting. In the 1920s, a man named Peter Walsh claimed to have been one of the children assigned to that very train. In a letter written late in his life, Walsh described being taken aboard in the dark of morning and seated beside boys he did not know. He remembered the first hour of travel clearly, the click of the wheels, the sway of the carriage, the chaperone walking the aisle. But then his memory fractured. He wrote of waking to silence, the benches around him empty, though the train was still in motion. I called out, he wrote, but no one answered. I walked the length of the car, and each door opened only to another emptiness. I do not know how long I wandered, but when the train stopped, I was no longer inside. Skeptics dismissed Walsh's account as invention. No corroborating records tie him to the event. Yet the details he described, the wooden benches, the dim lamps, the scent of coal smoke, ring unsettlingly true. Was it the imagination of an old man, or the fractured memory of something that defies explanation? There are other stranger stories still. A farmer's widow in Kansas claimed her mother once found a child wandering near the tracks days after the train passed through. The girl wore no shoes and spoke little English, yet she kept repeating the words, "Train empty, train empty." The woman said her mother tried to take the girl in, but within a week the child vanished without a trace. No missing person reports from that time match the story, but locals swore it happened. Then there are the lullabies. Several oral traditions, scattered across different states, mention the same peculiar detail. Travelers who swore they heard children's songs carried on the wind near abandoned rail lines. Not the kind of songs sung by adults to comfort, but the soft, off-key murmurs of children singing to each other in the dark. Some claimed the melodies were in languages unfamiliar, snatches of Irish, Italian, or German, reflecting the immigrant roots of many orphaned children. Others said the words were nonsense, more like humming than speech. What unites the accounts is the same refrain. The songs always seem to come from empty ground, as if sung by voices that had no bodies. Historians who encounter these stories struggle to reconcile them with the sparse records. Some suggest that survivors of the orphan trains, children who endured trauma and displacement, passed down their pain in ways that blurred fact with folklore. Others argue that descendants embellished stories to add weight to their family histories. And yet, there is something eerily consistent about the details. The pale faces at the windows, the laughter that vanished, the voices that lingered after the train was gone. One particularly chilling testimony surfaced in the 1970s, when a researcher interviewed a woman named Clara, whose grandmother claimed to have been on an orphan train that went wrong. According to Clara, her grandmother would not speak of the journey in detail, but late in life, plagued by dementia, she whispered fragments. "We were there," she said again and again. "All of us were there, but the men in black coats came. They told us to be quiet. They told us to sleep. When I woke up, I was outside, and the train was moving without us." Who were the men in black coats? No one knows. Perhaps it was an invention of illness, or a metaphor for the officials who handled the trains. In the minds of those who have heard the story, the image lingers. children led away into the darkness by figures who left no record behind. When pieced together, these whispered accounts create an unsettling mosaic. Diaries that falter mid-sentence, letters that describe empty cars, descendants who repeat words passed down like family curses. The stories may contradict one another, but they share a core of unease, that the children of the empty train were not simply lost, but displaced into a realm between history and legend. Whether taken literally or as echoes of grief, the survivor testimonies breathe life into the silence. They remind us that the children were real, with faces and voices that did not simply vanish. They lived in the memories of those who loved them, feared for them, or perhaps saw them one last time before the train arrived hollow. And that is the most haunting possibility of all, not that the children disappeared without trace, but that traces remain scattered across generations, like whispers in the dark, half heard, half believed, and impossible to silence. Long after the event itself faded into the yellowed pages of archives, something else remained. Not the paperwork, not the official records, but the stories. The ghost stories. Railroad workers, farmers, travelers, each generation seemed to add their own layers to the mystery of the empty train. And while historians might dismiss them as exaggerations, one truth is undeniable: the legend of the orphan train that arrived empty has become more ghost story than historical fact. Some of the earliest tales come from the very tracks themselves. Conductors traveling along the same route swore they sometimes caught sight of another train in the distance, a flicker of light on the rails ahead. But as they approached, the phantom train would vanish. No steam, no smoke, no metal wheels. Just a silence heavy enough to press against the chest. Some described hearing the faint cries of children when this phantom appeared, like laughter smothered beneath the rumble of an engine. By the early 1900s, the story had already shifted into folklore. Travelers along the line warned each other not to linger near the tracks after dark. They said you could hear the shuffle of small footsteps behind you, even when the earth lay bare. Some spoke of a phantom whistle that cut through the night, followed by the rustling of invisible children disembarking. A few even claimed they had seen small handprints on the windows of cabooses, left idling in the rail yard, though no children had boarded them. But the most chilling legends are the ones tied directly to encounters. One tale, collected in the 1930s by a folklorist in Nebraska, tells of a farmer who returned home late one evening to find half a dozen children sitting on his porch. Their clothes were ragged, their eyes dark with exhaustion. When he asked who they were, they answered simply, "We were meant to come here." The farmer, unsettled, tried to offer them food. But as he returned with bread and milk, the porch was empty. Only small footprints in the dirt remained, and even those faded within minutes, as if erased by unseen hands. In another account, railroad workers reported a strange occurrence near a lonely stretch of track. After halting their train for inspection, they heard what sounded like children playing, laughter and the patter of feet echoing in the dark. They followed the sounds, lanterns swaying in their hands, but found nothing. Only when they returned to their engine did they notice something unnerving. The dusty ground around their wheels was marked by dozens of tiny bare footprints, circling the train like a ring. Skeptics, of course, dismiss such stories as superstition. But the sheer persistence of the tales raises unsettling questions. Why children? Why laughter? Why the sense of presence in absence? Local lore deepens the unease. Several towns claim to have seen spectral children waiting at their depots, children who vanish the moment the train arrives. One popular telling describes a young boy, no more than 10 years old, who waves from the edge of the platform. His face, witnesses say, is pale as porcelain. His mouth opens as if to speak, but no words emerge. And just as the train slows to a stop, he disappears, leaving only the impression of his small form burned into the memories of those who saw him. The tale of the singing children may be the most widely spread. Travelers claim that in certain places, if the night is still and the wind blows across the prairie just right, you can hear a chorus of voices. Not birds, not insects, but children, singing a lullaby without words. The sound never lasts more than a minute. Some dismiss it as the wind through tall grass. Others, though, insist that once you hear it, you can never unhear it. The phantom song clings to you, like a memory you can't quite place. These legends were often told to children as warnings. Don't stray too close to the tracks, don't follow strange laughter in the dark, don't answer when someone small calls your name from the shadows. But there is something about the consistency of the reports that unsettles even the most hardened skeptic. Modern paranormal investigators have taken the stories further. In the late 20th century, groups carrying tape recorders and cameras visited the supposed routes of the empty train. Some claimed success. One investigator reported capturing faint voices on tape, children whispering phrases like "we're here" and "don't leave." Another swore he caught the distant sound of a train whistle in an area where no tracks had existed for nearly 100 years. Skeptics again scoffed. They called it interference, pareidolia, tricks of the mind. But the investigators insisted. If it's not the train, one said, then why do the voices always sound like children? There are even darker variations of the folklore, versions told in hushed tones. In these accounts, the children are not innocent presences, but something else entirely. Shadows with the shape of children, but eyes too large, smiles too wide. Figures that lure the living toward the tracks, only to vanish at the last second, leaving travelers shaken and disoriented. In some stories, people who follow the phantom children too far are never seen again. One unnerving tale tells of a couple driving late at night who saw what looked like a small figure standing beside the road. They stopped, thinking it was a lost child. The figure waved at them, beckoning closer. But when they drew near, they saw it was not a child at all, just an outline, thin as smoke with hollow pits for eyes. Before they could move, it stepped into the darkness and vanished. When they returned to their car, they found small handprints on the windows, pressed from the inside. Folklore thrives in silence, and the empty orphan train left silence enough to feed generations of stories. Whether the children truly vanished, or whether their absence became a canvas for ghostly imagination, the result is the same. A legend too enduring to die. Even now, locals will tell you, if you stand near the abandoned lines on a still night, you may see lights flickering where no train should be. You may hear voices carried by the wind, high and thin, like children calling from the dark. And if you listen too long, you may feel a tug at your sleeve, small cold fingers, reminding you of those who never arrived. Every ghost story has roots, and the legend of the empty orphan train is no different. While the whispers of phantom children and spectral laughter haunt the imagination, there is a darker, quieter truth that lingers just beneath. The orphan train era itself was haunted, not by apparitions but by decisions made in boardrooms and charity halls, by well-meaning reformers and careless bureaucrats who underestimated the weight of uprooted lives. The movement was born out of desperation. By the mid-19th century, New York City was overflowing with abandoned children. Immigration, poverty, disease, and death had left thousands without homes or families. Reformers like Charles Loring Brace of the Children's Aid Society saw the problem in stark terms. If these children remained in the streets, they would become criminals. If they were relocated west, they might become farmers, laborers, wives and mothers, productive members of a young, expanding nation. On paper, it sounded almost benevolent. A chance for survival, a chance for a future. But the reality was harsher. The children were herded onto trains by the dozens, labeled as orphans, whether they had parents or not. Many came from immigrant families who were poor but not absent, only to find their children taken away by systems that saw poverty as neglect. Once on the trains, the children were paraded through towns like livestock at auction. Families inspected their teeth, their muscles, their posture. Brothers and sisters were often split apart. Those who weren't chosen were sent further west, again and again, until someone claimed them, or until the paperwork lost track of them
altogether.
It is no wonder, then, that folklore clings to these journeys. For the children themselves, the experience was often a living ghost story. Imagine being 6 years old, placed in the arms of strangers, told to smile so you might be chosen. Imagine watching your sibling vanish into another family, knowing you might never see them again. For many, that horror was more real than any phantom train. Historians estimate that between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children were relocated in this way. Some found loving homes, others did not. Many were treated as free labor, expected to work the fields or keep house, their small bodies pressed into service long before they reached adulthood. Abuse was common, though rarely recorded. And for those who vanished into silence, children without records, without graves, the mystery becomes indistinguishable from legend. The societal shadow of this movement explains why ghost stories flourished. The empty train became a metaphor for the many children who were lost, not just those rumored to vanish, but those who disappeared into systems that never cared to follow them. Every whispered tale of laughter in the night, every phantom voice on the wind, echoes the real cries of children torn from everything they knew. Some researchers argue that the legend of the empty train may not refer to one event at all, but to the cumulative weight of thousands of such disappearances. A symbolic story, born from the grief of towns that prepared but never received, of children who boarded but never arrived, of families torn apart in silence. In this reading, the phantom children are not ghosts in the traditional sense, but the memories of a generation caught between poverty and promise. But folklore has a way of magnifying wounds into hauntings. Families who welcomed orphans into their homes often spoke of the children's unease, their night terrors, their refusal to sleep in quiet rooms, their panic at the sound of train whistles. In diaries and oral accounts, foster parents described children waking in the night screaming, convinced they were about to be taken again. These were the psychological shadows of the orphan train experience. To those who heard the screams, though, they may have sounded like the cries of the lost. Communities too carried their scars. For some towns the train never arrived, leaving them with empty arms and unanswered questions. For others, the children who did arrive were strangers in every way, foreign accents, unfamiliar customs, skin a shade too dark for comfort in certain communities. They were not always welcomed. The dissonance between expectation and reality bred resentment, gossip and sometimes cruelty. This too fed the legends. A child rejected, cast out or mistreated became part of the larger ghost story, an orphan whose spirit might still wander the rails. Even the reformers themselves could not escape the weight of their choices. Charles Loring Brace, hailed as the father of the movement, was both praised and condemned. To his supporters, he was a visionary who saved children from starvation. To his critics, he was a thief who stole children from their families, shattering immigrant communities in the process. His vision of America was one of assimilation, children stripped of their languages, their traditions, their connections to the old world. It was a cultural haunting, erasing heritage in the name of progress. And so when we speak of the ghost train, we are not merely speaking of spirits on the rails. We are speaking of the ghosts of assimilation, of poverty, of children lost in paperwork, of families broken by reform. These are the shadows that linger long after the tracks have rusted. The legend of the empty train is powerful precisely because it straddles the line between history and myth. It reflects both the literal disappearances, the children who never reached their destinations, and the metaphorical ones, the vanishing of cultures, names and identities under the relentless machine of progress. It is the story of America's growing pains written not in ink, but in absence. Perhaps that is why the folklore endures. Not because people truly expect to see a phantom train rolling through the night, but because deep down they recognize the truth it represents. Children were lost. Stories were silenced. Entire lives vanished into the cracks of history. And when people stand on the abandoned tracks, when they hear whispers in the tall grass, when they see faint lights flickering in the distance, they are not just seeing ghosts. They are seeing memory itself, refusing to be buried. The societal shadow of the orphan trains is in many ways the real haunting. Every empty cradle, every lost surname, every forgotten song is another ghost clinging to the rails. And perhaps the true horror is not that a single train arrived empty, but that so many did arrive, filled with children whose lives would be erased in quieter, slower ways. Obsession has always followed the story of the empty train. What began as a whisper in one town soon grew into a shadow that stretched across generations. It was not just the children who vanished that night, but the certainty of truth itself. And when truth is withheld, it breeds obsession. The earliest obsessives were the townsfolk themselves. Families who had prepared to welcome children could not let go of the unanswered question, where did they go? For months, some refused to believe the train had been empty at all. They wrote letters to the Children's Aid Society, demanding explanations. They sent telegrams to neighboring towns, asking whether the children had been rerouted there. The answers they received were inconsistent. Some claimed the children had been sent elsewhere. Others denied any such train had existed. The contradictions deepened the wound. One farmer's widow, whose house had been prepared for a young boy, kept the small bed made for him until the day she died. Visitors to her home recalled that the quilt never gathered dust, as though she cleaned it daily, waiting for someone who never came. To her descendants, she became known as the Waiting Woman, a family ghost who haunted not by dying but by never letting go. Decades later, the obsession shifted to researchers and folklorists. In the 1920s and 30s, the Federal Writers Project collected oral histories across the Midwest. Interviewers kept encountering versions of the same tale: the train that arrived empty, the children who vanished, the laughter on the wind. What should have been a simple piece of folklore grew complicated when different communities told the same story, separated by hundreds of miles, yet echoing the same details. Some collectors began to wonder if there had been more than one empty train. The possibility drove them to scour archives, searching for manifests and ledgers. What they found only deepened the mystery: missing pages, contradictory numbers, lists of children with no destinations attached. The absence of evidence became its own form of evidence, and so the obsession spread. In the 1960s, amateur historians and paranormal enthusiasts took up the case. One man, Harold Benton, dedicated nearly 20 years of his life to what he called the Hollow Train Project. Benton traveled the country, interviewing elderly descendants of those who claimed to have waited that night. He amassed boxes of notes, sketches of train routes, maps marked with pins. His notes reveal a mind slowly unraveling. Early entries are clear and methodical. Dates, names, records cross-referenced. Later, his handwriting becomes frantic, sprawling across margins. They hear them still, singing, "And why won't they let me see the manifests?" Benton died in 1982, his research unpublished. When his children went through his belongings, they discovered dozens of notebooks filled with scribbles, many repeating the same phrase over and over: "We are still on board." Even today, descendants of those who waited for the train sometimes speak of their families as cursed. Some claim the story has shaped their lives, that they feel compelled to uncover the truth, as though it were a family obligation. A woman interviewed in the early 2000s described how her grandfather would sit her down every winter and retell the story of the empty train, insisting that one day she must find the truth. "It felt less like a story," she said, "and more like an inheritance, as though the children belonged to us, even if they never came." This is how the legend consumes, by embedding itself in families until the obsession is indistinguishable from memory. Paranormal investigators, too, have fed the madness. In the late 20th century, when ghost hunting became a popular subculture, teams sought out the abandoned lines tied to the orphan train story. Some claimed success. One group reported hearing voices on tape, faint but unmistakably childlike. Another claimed their cameras captured flickers of pale faces in the windows of rusted train cars. Each investigation produced more questions than answers. Skeptics pointed to faulty equipment, audio interference, or deliberate hoaxes. Believers saw confirmation of what they already knew, that the children had never truly left. The obsession reached an extreme in 1997, when a man named Edward Mallory vanished while retracing the supposed route of the train. Mallory, a railway enthusiast and amateur folklorist, had spent years charting the orphan train lines, convinced he could pinpoint the exact stretch where the children disappeared. He set out one autumn evening, carrying only a notebook and a tape recorder. He was never seen again. Searchers later found his belongings near an overgrown section of track. His notebook contained only a single sentence, scrawled on the last page: They're still singing. Some dismiss Mallory's disappearance as unrelated, chalking it up to accident or foul play. But for those who believe his story became part of the legend, proof that the train still demands something from the living. What makes this story so consuming is not only the mystery itself, but its refusal to resolve. Every record examined collapses into contradiction. Every testimony leaves gaps. Every investigation produces more questions than answers. The closer one gets to the truth, the more it slips away, like smoke through grasping fingers. It is here that the line between history and madness begins to blur. What does it mean to dedicate your life to a train that may never have existed, or to children who may have never boarded? And yet the emptiness itself has weight. People have gone mad trying to explain it. Others have been silenced by its unanswered questions. Families, investigators, folklorists, each caught in the gravitational pull of the hollow train. Perhaps that is the greatest curse of all, not the loss of the children, but the loss of certainty. To look at the empty station, the silent records, the phantom whispers, and know that you will never truly know. That gap, that absence becomes a wound, and wounds demand attention, even if it destroys the one who stares too long. The descent into madness is not simply the fate of individuals obsessed with the story. It is the fate of history itself when truth slips away. The empty orphan train did not just carry children into oblivion. It carried with it the minds of those who tried and failed to bring them back. The story of the empty orphan train should have ended a century ago. Its records should have faded into dust, its memory confined to footnotes in history books. But legends, especially those soaked in sorrow, do not fade so easily. Instead, they resurface again and again, finding new life in modern voices, new shapes in contemporary fears. Today, the ghost of the orphan train travels in more ways than one. Along abandoned tracks and overgrown rail beds, people still whisper of strange encounters, echoes of laughter, phantom whistles and spectral lights moving where no engine should be. Yet the story has also escaped the rails, bleeding into popular imagination, ghost tours, paranormal shows, and online forums, where believers and skeptics wage their endless battles. The train may no longer run, but its shadow still moves across the land. Some of the most persistent modern sightings come from railway enthusiasts who explore forgotten lines. In Kansas, a group of hobbyists reported hearing what they described as a distant whistle, faint and sad, while walking along a stretch of track that had not been used for over 70 years. They insisted the sound was not an echo from any nearby railway. It came from the abandoned line itself. One of the men claimed he heard voices, thin and high, as though carried by the wind. "Children," he said. It was children, laughing. In Iowa, hikers near a disused bridge told of seeing lights moving slowly across the trestle at night. At first, they thought it was another group with lanterns, but when the lights reached the center of the bridge, they flickered out, leaving only the creak of wood in the silence. Paranormal investigators, who later visited the site, brought audio recorders. Some swore their tapes captured the faint sound of a train clattering across iron rails, rails that had long since been torn up. These stories, of course, spread quickly in the age of the internet. On forums dedicated to ghost hunting and folklore, threads about the orphan train appear every few months. Some posters share family stories, insisting their grandparents or great-grandparents waited at the station that night. Others recount strange encounters of their own, hearing footsteps on gravel near the tracks, finding small handprints smudged on the windows of cars parked nearby, catching glimpses of pale figures in the brush. Skeptics laugh, calling it hysteria, but the believers keep returning, feeding the legend with each retelling. The ghost train has even entered the world of paranormal entertainment. Television shows devoted to hauntings have aired episodes on the legend, sending investigators to abandoned stations with thermal cameras and EVP recorders. In one widely discussed segment, a team captured what they claimed was a child's voice whispering, "I'm still here." The recording was grainy, ambiguous, easily dismissed as static. Yet for many viewers, it was confirmation that the empty train was more than just folklore. Ghost tours in certain Midwestern towns now include the orphan train among their stops. Guides lead visitors to old depots and stretches of rail, spinning tales of the night the train arrived hollow. They encourage tourists to listen for laughter, to watch for flickering lights, to feel the tug of unseen hands. Some dismiss these tours as cashing in on tragedy. Others argue they keep memory alive. Either way, the story is no longer just history. It is economy, entertainment, spectacle. And then there are the cultural echoes. Writers have woven the legend into horror novels, reframing the train as a spectral vehicle that collects souls. Filmmakers have drawn inspiration from the tale, using images of empty rail cars and vanished children as symbols of loss. Musicians, too, have written songs about ghost trains, though rarely naming the orphan train directly. The imagery is too powerful to ignore. An empty vessel, a promise unfulfilled, a journey that never reaches its end. But perhaps the most unsettling modern development is the persistence of personal encounters, ordinary people claiming to have met the children themselves. One widely circulated story comes from a woman in Nebraska who said she was driving late one night when she saw a boy standing by the roadside. Thinking he was lost, she pulled over, but as she approached, he vanished. When she returned to her car, she found small dusty footprints across her hood. Another man in Missouri claimed he was camping near an old line when he woke to the sound of singing. He swore he saw a group of children walking single file through the trees, their faces pale, their eyes blank. By the time he blinked, they were gone. Stories like these, whether true or imagined, keep the legend alive in the digital age. They spread across message boards, podcasts and YouTube channels, reaching audiences far removed from the towns that first whispered of the train. Each retelling adds a new layer, each citing another verse in a song that refuses to end. Skeptics argue that the legend's endurance is simple psychology. The orphan trains were real, their tragedies undeniable. Ghost stories are the natural result of such history, a way for communities to process grief and guilt. What better image than an empty train to symbolize the lives lost to poverty, neglect, and bureaucracy? The spectral children, they say, are metaphors, not manifestations, but for believers, metaphors are not enough. The consistency of the accounts, the laughter, the singing, the small handprints, suggests something more. Too many people, across too many years, have described the same phenomena. And if they are all wrong, then why does the story feel so heavy, so present, so impossible to ignore? In the end, the modern return of the ghost train is not just about paranormal sightings or haunted tourism. It is about how stories refuse to die. The orphan train that arrived empty has become larger than itself, transcending history to enter the realm of cultural haunting. It exists in ghost tours and internet forums, in songs and novels, in whispered stories around campfires. It exists whenever someone hears a whistle in the night and wonders if the children are still aboard. The train may have been empty when it arrived, but in memory, in folklore, in the restless imagination of those who cannot stop listening, it is still full, carrying not only the children who vanished, but everyone who has ever feared being lost, forgotten, or left behind. The empty orphan train lingers in our imagination, not only because of its mystery, but because it touches something primal, an ache buried deep in the human psyche. Ghost stories survive when they speak to fears that are universal, and in this legend, two fears converge: the fear of vanishing without a trace, and the fear of children lost, forgotten, or abandoned. Trains themselves have always carried symbolic weight. They are vehicles of progress, of destiny, of irreversible journeys. To step aboard a train is to surrender control, to be carried toward a future you cannot change. In the 19th century, when the orphan trains were real, they represented hope and horror in equal measure, salvation for some, separation and trauma for others. The train was both deliverance and exile. To imagine a train that arrives empty is to confront the betrayal of that promise, the idea that even salvation can vanish, leaving nothing behind. Children, too, occupy a special place in folklore and fear. Across cultures, ghost stories often center on children, not because they are harmless, but because their innocence makes their suffering unbearable. A lost child is a wound in the community, a failure of protection, a reminder of vulnerability. When a ghost is a child, it is not just frightening, it is tragic, pulling at the deepest threads of empathy and guilt. The orphan train legend fuses these two symbols, the unstoppable train and the vanished child, into one image that is almost unbearable to contemplate. It is not simply a ghost story. It is a parable about loss, powerlessness, and the cracks in society's promises. Psychologists who study folklore often argue that such stories serve as containers for collective trauma. The real orphan trains left scars, children separated from their families, siblings torn apart, some thriving, many not. Communities remember this pain, even if official history papers over the details. Legends like the empty train allow that pain to surface without ever naming it directly. The story says what history cannot, that something was taken, that something was wrong, that the cost of progress was unbearable. And yet there is more. Beyond cultural trauma, the story gnaws at individual fears of erasure. To vanish without explanation, to be swallowed by silence, that is a fate more terrifying than death. Death, at least, is final. Disappearance is eternal. The empty train becomes a metaphor for all the times we have stared into absence, a missing child, a lost loved one, an unanswered question. This fear is not confined to folklore. It surfaces again and again in our nightmares and our art. Think of the fascination with missing persons, with planes that vanish from the sky, with ships that set sail and never return. The human mind recoils from gaps in the record. Where certainty ends, imagination begins, and imagination is rarely kind. The orphan train legend pushes this psychological terror even further because it multiplies the absence. It is not one missing child, but dozens, not one unanswered question, but a chorus of them. A whole trainload gone. The magnitude makes it overwhelming, as though the world itself cracked open and swallowed innocence whole. There is also the question of agency. In most ghost stories, there is a perpetrator, a reason, a curse. Here, there is only silence. No wreckage, no bodies, no explanation, just emptiness. That absence of cause is its own horror. It denies us the comfort of resolution, leaving only a void that cannot be filled. Paranormal theorists argue that this is precisely why the legend persists. The mind craves closure, and in its absence, it begins to invent. We conjure ghostly laughter, phantom whistles, spectral children, because the alternative, the gaping silence, is too much to bear. In this way, the legend becomes self-sustaining. Each new generation projects its fears into the emptiness, and the train carries them forward like cargo. Cultural historians might say the ghost train also reflects anxieties about industrialization. Trains were once marvels of progress, but they were also dangerous, noisy, unstoppable machines that reshaped landscapes and lives. To rural communities, they brought both opportunity and disruption. A train that arrives empty, promising something but delivering nothing, embodies that ambivalence, the betrayal of hope by the machinery of progress. On a more intimate level, the story resonates with the fear of broken promises. The families who waited at the station expected children. They had prepared homes, meals, futures. Instead, they received nothing. This betrayal echoes on a personal scale. How many times have we prepared for something, only to find it never arrives? How many times have we invested love or trust, only to meet silence? The empty train becomes a mirror for all our disappointments, magnified to unbearable scale. And then there is the role of children's voices. Laughter, singing, whispers, these sounds recur again and again in the testimonies of those who claim to have encountered the ghost train. Psychologists note that such sounds trigger a unique unease in adults. Children's voices out of place, especially at night, in lonely places, signal danger, vulnerability, and dissonance. To hear them where no children should be is to feel the ground of reality slip. It is the uncanny at its purest. But perhaps the deepest horror lies in the legend's suggestion of a liminal state. Children caught between departure and arrival, forever in transit, never reaching safety. They are not simply gone, they are trapped on a journey that never ends. This limbo speaks to a universal human fear, that we too might one day find ourselves stranded between destinations, unable to move forward, unable to return. And so the orphan train that arrived empty is more than history, more than folklore. It is a reflection of the human condition itself, our longing for closure, our fear of absence, our inability to bear unanswered questions. We tell the story not because it is true, but because it feels true, because it captures something we cannot say any other way. This is the psychological horror at its core, not just a ghost train, not just vanished children, but the unbearable idea that some journeys never end, some questions never resolve, and some silences echo louder than any scream. The empty train does not simply haunt the rails, it haunts the mind, the culture, the spaces between memory and history, and in that haunting, it reveals why we return to it, again and again. Because in its hollow cars we see our deepest fears reflected back at us. When faced with a mystery as vast as the empty orphan train, the human mind refuses to rest. Stories this large, this heavy demand answers, even if those answers cannot be proven. Over the decades, historians, folklorists, skeptics and believers have each offered their theories. None of them explain everything. Each leaves gaps, shadows and contradictions. Yet together, they form a mosaic of possibility, the closest thing we may ever have to an explanation. The first and most straightforward theory is bureaucratic error. The orphan trains were poorly documented, their ledgers often inconsistent, incomplete, or simply lost. Some historians suggest the train in question may have been cancelled or rerouted, and the families waiting at the station never informed. In this view, the empty arrival was nothing more than miscommunication compounded by poor record-keeping. The children may have been sent to another town entirely, their names swallowed in missing pages and clerical mistakes. But this theory, neat as it sounds, falters under scrutiny. Families insisted they had official letters confirming the train would arrive. Local papers even mentioned the event beforehand. And yet when the night came, the train that rolled in was hollow. If this was a bureaucratic mishap, why did no records surface later to correct it? Why did no one ever find the missing children in another town? A second theory shifts from error to cover-up. Some researchers believe the children may have died en route, whether from illness, accident, or something more sinister. If dozens of orphans perished during transport, the Children's Aid Society or the rail company may have silenced the truth to avoid scandal. In the 19th century, institutions were known to hide tragedies, especially when it came to vulnerable populations. The children in this view never vanished into thin air. They were buried quietly, their deaths erased from official history. Yet this theory also leaves holes. No mass graves have ever been found linked to the orphan trains. No secret burial sites have surfaced along the supposed routes. If a cover-up occurred, it was executed with eerie perfection, leaving no trace but rumor. And what of the families who claimed they heard children's laughter in the distance, who swore they glimpsed faces at the windows? Can silence and secrecy account for so many witnesses haunted by the same details? Then comes the third theory, folklore evolution. According to this interpretation, the empty orphan train was never one event at all. Instead, it was a story, born from smaller tragedies, retold and reshaped until it solidified into legend. The real orphan trains carried pain, separation, and loss. Some children disappeared into abuse, some into graves. Communities processed this trauma through story. The empty train became a vessel for collective memory, a way to embody all the vanished lives in one haunting image. Folklorists note how the story surfaces across multiple towns, each with slight variations. In some, the train is entirely empty. In others, it arrives with only a single crying child or a silent conductor who vanishes when spoken to. This fluidity suggests myth rather than fact. And yet, the consistency of certain details, the laughter, the singing, the sense of anticipation betrayed, suggests something deeper than simple invention. Beyond folklore lies the paranormal theory, that the empty orphan train is a ghost itself, a spectral replay of history. Ghost trains have long been part of folklore worldwide, from the phantom carriages of Europe to the spectral locomotives of North America. These tales often emerge around tragedies, wrecks, mass deaths, disasters tied to the rails. In this view, the orphan train is a haunting, not of one child or one family, but of an entire era's sorrow. The train carries the weight of countless children uprooted, abandoned, and forgotten. It does not appear to deliver, but to remind. Believers in the supernatural point to the repeated accounts of sounds and sights that defy explanation, children's voices recorded on tape, lights flickering along abandoned tracks, vanished footprints in the snow. They argue that the story's persistence across decades and locations is proof of a phenomenon beyond folklore, something real, something unearthly, echoing across time. There are even darker supernatural theories. Some whisper that the train was never of this world at all, that it was a vessel of the in-between, collecting souls rather than passengers. In these tales, the orphans never arrived because they were never meant to. They were claimed by something else, something unseen. The empty train becomes not a mistake of history, but a glimpse into another reality, where innocence is swallowed and never returned. And then there is the psychological theory, which argues the train is less about history or hauntings and more about the mind itself. Absence gnaws at us. When a community gathers to receive children, prepares homes and futures, and is met instead with silence, the imagination fills the gap. One person claims to hear a whistle where none should be. Another swears they saw faces in the windows. Soon the entire town is caught in a web of expectation turned hallucination. The story is born not from reality, but from the collective need to explain a wound too deep to leave unspoken. Each of these theories offers something. None of them explain everything. Bureaucratic error cannot account for the consistency of folklore. Cover-up cannot erase the absence of evidence. Folklore cannot explain the modern sightings. Paranormal explanations demand belief. Psychological theories demand doubt. Each leaves us circling the same hollow station, staring at the same train that should not be. Perhaps the truth lies in the overlap. Perhaps there was a bureaucratic failure, amplified by trauma, reshaped into legend, and haunted by echoes of sorrow too deep to die. Or perhaps the truth will never be known at all. The orphan train that arrived empty may exist precisely to deny us certainty, to remind us that some stories are not meant to resolve, and so the train remains, a riddle of history, a scar of trauma, a ghost of folklore. We chase explanations as though they were children vanishing into the dark, but they slip away, leaving only the sound of wheels on empty rails. The story of the orphan train that arrived empty resists ending. Like the train itself, it circles endlessly, refusing to stop, refusing to release its passengers, its secrets, or its grip on our imagination. And yet, every story must have a conclusion, even if that conclusion is only silence. When we trace the legend from its origins, we see not just one mystery, but a constellation of them. There were the real orphan trains, moving thousands of children across the country in search of homes, scattering lives into directions that could never be reunited. There were the families who waited with open doors and open hearts, only to receive nothing but emptiness. There were the whispers that spread across towns and generations, each retelling, reshaping the truth, until it became both unrecognizable and undeniable. And through it all, the image persists, a train that arrives hollow, carrying absence like cargo, delivering nothing but silence. This silence is what haunts us. It is what makes the legend stronger than mere history. History can be resolved, explained, placed neatly in records. Legends thrive on the opposite, on gaps, on contradictions, on unanswered questions. The empty train is powerful precisely because it offers no resolution. It is a mirror held up to our deepest fears, that we may wait, prepare, hope, and still be left with nothing. Think of the families at the station. Imagine the mothers clutching blankets, the fathers pacing in nervous anticipation. Imagine the children waiting at home, excited to meet new siblings, imagining playmates who would soon arrive. And then, the sound of the whistle, the thunder of wheels, the rush of steam, a moment of relief, of certainty. The train has come, the promise will be fulfilled. And then, nothing. Cars hollow, windows empty, doors opening to silence. That moment is the wound, the rupture, the scar that time cannot heal. Every retelling of the legend drags us back to that station, to that moment of betrayal. We stand again, among the waiting families. We feel the air heavy with anticipation. We hear the whistle in the dark, and when the train comes empty, we feel the same hollow drop in our stomachs, the same cold realization there will be no resolution. But the story is not only about loss, it is also about endurance. The fact that we still tell it proves something vital, that memory refuses to be silenced, even when truth is buried. Whether the children vanished in fact, or only in imagination, their absence carved a space so deep it demanded to be filled with story. And so we filled it with whispers of laughter, with phantom lights, with a train that still rolls across abandoned tracks. In doing so, we ensured that they are never forgotten, even if their names are lost. There is a paradox here, a cruel irony. The orphan train legend began as a story of absence, of nothingness. Yet in the century since, it has become heavy with presence, thick with voices, sightings, recordings, theories, retellings. An empty train that somehow carries everything: history, grief, folklore, superstition, hope, despair. The hollow cars are crowded now, not with children, but with the weight of everyone who has ever told the story, listened to it, or tried to explain it. And still the question remains, what happened that night? Was it a simple clerical error, a train that never was? Was it a tragedy hidden under layers of shame and silence? Was it folklore crystallizing into something that felt truer than truth? Or was it something else, something spectral, something beyond our ability to categorize? A train that moves not through space, but through memory and fear. Each listener must decide for themselves. But no decision will end the legend. The whistle will continue to echo. The laughter will continue to drift across empty fields. The footprints will continue to appear on dusty windows and snow-covered cars. Because legends are not bound by proof. They are bound by belief, by memory, by the aching persistence of questions that will never be answered. Perhaps that is why the orphan train still rolls in the imagination, because deep down we all fear the station, the waiting, the emptiness. We all fear preparing a place for something, or someone, who never arrives. We all fear being forgotten, erased, or left behind. And in that fear, the legend finds fuel. The children may have been lost to time. Their names may never be recovered, their fates never revealed. But the story ensures they are never gone. They live on in whispers, in shadows, in the half-heard songs that drift through abandoned depots. They live on each time the whistle sounds where no train runs, each time someone pauses on an empty track and feels the hair rise on their arms. And maybe that is the final truth of the orphan train. Not that it explains itself, not that it resolves, but that it reminds. It reminds us of what was lost, of what we fear losing, of the emptiness we all carry. It reminds us that history is not always neat, that the past bleeds into the present, that silence can be louder than sound. The train arrives. It is empty, and yet it is full of memory, of sorrow, of voices we cannot silence. So the next time you hear a whistle in the night, far from any active tracks, pause, listen closely. Do you hear the wheels on rails long abandoned? Do you hear the laughter, faint and high, as though carried on the wind? Do you feel the weight of absence pressing close, the sense that something is there, just beyond reach? If you do, then you too have stepped onto the platform where generations have stood before you, waiting for a train that will never arrive, haunted by a promise that will never be fulfilled. And maybe, in that moment, you will understand why the orphan train that arrived empty will never stop running, because it is not just a story, it is not just folklore, it is not just history, it is a wound that became a legend, a silence that became a scream, a train that never carried children, but instead carries us all through fear, through memory, through the endless night. And it will keep rolling, long after we are gone. Epilogues are meant to bring closure, but closure is impossible when the story itself is about emptiness. And so, in speaking of the orphan train that arrived empty, we must accept that our ending cannot be an answer. It can only be an echo. The echo begins with the stations. Many of them still stand, weathered wood, peeling paint, crumbling platforms where weeds push through cracks. Locals pass them without thought, barely glancing at the forgotten structures. But those who pause, who linger, say the air grows heavy there. They speak of shadows that do not match their sources, of voices on the wind, of the faint rattle of wheels where there are no tracks. The depots have become memorials, not through plaques or monuments, but through the persistence of presence. Every whisper of the story breathes new life into them. And then there are the tracks themselves, lines of iron and wood, abandoned to time. In some places, the rails have been pulled up, leaving only faint scars in the earth. In others, they remain, rusted, half-buried, curling into fields that no longer need them. Yet again and again, people claim the same thing, that when they walk those tracks at dusk, they feel watched, they feel followed. Some report hearing footsteps behind them, small and quick, vanishing the moment they turn. Others swear they hear laughter, carried faintly, impossibly, across the empty fields. The landscape remembers, the story is etched, not only in human memory, but in the ground itself. Folklore scholars often argue that legends survive because they are useful, because they explain the inexplicable, because they hold communities together, because they warn of dangers real or imagined. But the empty orphan train feels different. It offers no warning, no lesson, no tidy moral. Instead, it offers a question, one that gnaws rather than teaches. And maybe that is why it endures. A lesson can be learned and forgotten. A question lingers forever. This is the true power of the orphan train story. It does not end when told. It sits with you, follows you, waits for you. Even now, as you hear these words, you may feel it stirring. A thought you cannot shake, a sound you cannot quite place. A whistle just beyond hearing, a laugh just beyond reach. The story becomes part of you, moving through your thoughts like a train in the night, unstoppable, inevitable. Perhaps that is what the legend wanted all along, not to explain, not to resolve, but to spread, to plant itself in minds, to travel not on rails but through memory, belief, imagination. In this way, the empty train continues its journey. Its passengers are not children anymore. Its passengers are us, everyone who has ever heard, ever wondered, ever felt the chill of absence. The epilogue also belongs to the descendants. Families who still tell the story at gatherings, grandparents who still whisper about the night the train came hollow. For them, the legend is less a ghost story than a lineage. It is an inheritance, a reminder that their ancestors waited and were betrayed. Some say their bloodlines are cursed, haunted not by ghosts, but by a silence that will not break. They carry it with them, across states, across generations. Wherever they go, the orphan train follows. And there are the modern seekers, the ghost hunters, the folklorists, the wanderers, who walk forgotten tracks by moonlight. They too carry the story forward. Every EVP recording, every grainy photograph, every blurry video uploaded online, ensures the orphan train will never be confined to the past. It moves with technology, adapting, reshaping, growing louder with each new telling. The legend has become digital, global, untethered from the depots and tracks where it began. Now, anyone, anywhere, can stand on that platform in their imagination, listening for the whistle. The deeper truth is this: we need stories like this. Not because they comfort us, but because they confront us. They remind us of the fragility of our certainties, the hollowness of our promises, the inevitability of our losses. The orphan train is not just about vanished children. It is about the spaces left behind when what we expect, what we prepare for, what we desperately want, never arrives. It is about waiting at the station for something that never comes. And who among us has not done that, in one form or another? So what do we do with this story, this wound that refuses to close? Do we seek explanations until we unravel into obsession? Do we dismiss it as folklore, comforting ourselves with rationality? Do we surrender to the supernatural, accepting that some mysteries lie beyond proof? Perhaps the answer does not matter. Perhaps the act of telling, of keeping the story alive, is the only resolution we will ever have. Still, one question lingers. If the train arrived empty, where did the children go? This is the question that cannot be buried, cannot be silenced. Every theory circles back to it, every whisper drags us toward it, and every time, we are met with the same silence. The silence of records lost, the silence of graves unfound, the silence of phantom whistles in the night, the silence of emptiness itself. And maybe that is the most terrifying truth of all, that there are no answers, that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but to be endured, that we are not investigators standing at the edge of discovery, but passengers already aboard, carried toward a destination we will never reach. So if you find yourself near abandoned rails, if you walk by a forgotten station at dusk, if you hear a whistle where there should be none, pause, listen, watch. You may see nothing, you may hear only silence. But remember this, emptiness is not nothing. Emptiness is weight. Emptiness is presence. Emptiness is the train that still arrives, again and again, in every telling, in every listener, in every restless dream. The orphan train did not vanish into history. It rolls still, not on iron, but in the corridors of memory. Its whistle is the sound of absence, its windows the reflection of our fears, its destination unknown. And though this is the end of our telling, the train itself will not stop. It will continue, forever hollow, forever full, forever arriving, forever empty,